The thermometer outside Mike Anderson's cabin window read 40 degrees below zero, and it was still dropping. In the 5 years he'd lived in this remote corner of Alaska, he had never seen the temperature fall so low. The approaching storm system wasn't just another winter challenge. It was the kind that made even the most hardened wilderness dwellers question their choices. Deep in the heart of Alaska's wilderness, where the nearest town was a 4-hour drive away, his cabin stood as a solitary outpost against the unforgiving landscape. The wooden structure, weathered by countless storms, had been his home since he chose to leave his bustling life as a wildlife photographer in Seattle. Tonight, as the wind howled through the towering pines, the decision to live here would test him like never before. The February morning had started like any other. Mike woke up to the familiar sound of crackling wood in his fireplace, the warmth from the dying embers barely reaching the corners of his modest living room. Through his frost-covered windows, he could see fresh snow had fallen overnight, adding another thick blanket to the already deep drifts. At 45 years old, Mike had developed a careful routine that kept him alive in these harsh conditions. Every morning began with checking his weather radio, assessing his supplies, and maintaining his essential equipment. His cabin, though simple, was well stocked with preserved food, medical supplies, and emergency gear. The walls were lined with photographs he had taken over the years, images of wolves, moose, and bears in their natural habitat served as silent companions in his solitude. The weather report that morning was particularly concerning. The storm system moving in from the north promised to bring temperatures down to record lows and winds strong enough to snap trees. Mike knew from experience that these were the kind of conditions that could trap someone indoors for days, maybe even weeks. He spent the morning securing his generator and checking his backup heating system. The routine was second nature to him now, but he never allowed himself to become careless. In the wilderness, one small mistake could be fatal. His father's old saying echoed in his mind, "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son." Those words had kept him alive more times than he could count. By the afternoon, the first wave of the storm arrived. Snow fell in thick curtains, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond his porch. Mike added more logs to his fireplace and began his usual storm preparations. He filled several large containers with water, knowing his pipes might freeze despite the heat tape he had carefully wrapped around them. He moved additional firewood inside and checked his emergency lanterns. Living alone in such extreme conditions had changed Mike in ways he hadn't expected. The constant awareness of nature's power had made him more patient, more observant. He had learned to read the subtle signs in his environment, the way the birds fell silent before a storm, the change in air pressure that made his ears pop slightly, the particular quality of stillness that preceded dangerous weather. His satellite phone, his only reliable connection to the outside world, sat charged and ready on his desk next to his emergency radio. The nearest ranger station was 50 miles away, and in weather like this, help would be impossible for days if anything went wrong. Mike had learned to live with this isolation, finding peace in the quiet moments and strength in self-reliance. As evening approached, the storm intensified. The wind found every tiny gap in the cabin's walls, creating an eerie whistling sound that Mike had never quite gotten used to. He prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, conserving his fresh supplies for what might be a long stretch indoors. What happened next would challenge everything he knew about survival in the wilderness. The first sign that something was different came just after midnight. Through the howling wind, Mike heard a sound that made him sit up straight in his chair, a deep, guttural noise, barely audible over the storm but unmistakable to someone who had spent years photographing wildlife. A bear. And it was close to his cabin. In February, bears should be deep in hibernation. The fact that one was active in these conditions meant something was terribly wrong. Mike grabbed his flashlight and approached his window cautiously. The beam cut through the swirling snow, but visibility was still poor. The temperature display now showed 45 below zero, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. Then he saw them. 3 dark shapes moved through the whiteout, their forms barely visible against the snow, a mother bear and 2 cubs. Their movements were slow and labored. Even from inside, Mike could see they were struggling. The mother bear's usual powerful stride was reduced to an exhausted shuffle, and the cubs huddled close to her, fighting against the brutal wind. Years of wildlife observation had taught Mike to read animal behavior, and what he saw worried him deeply. The mother bear was desperate. No animal would willingly expose their cubs to these conditions unless they had no choice. Something must have disturbed their den, forcing them out into this killing weather. The bears made their way closer to his cabin, seeking shelter from the relentless wind. In the beam of his flashlight, Mike could see ice forming on their fur. The cubs were shivering violently, their small bodies not built to withstand such extreme cold. The mother bear's movements became increasingly unsteady, her strength visibly failing. Mike's heart raced as the bears approached his porch. This was exactly the kind of situation every wilderness safety guide warned against. Bears near human structures were dangerous under normal circumstances. But these circumstances were far from normal. The desperate mother bear might try anything to protect her cubs from the cold. Through the window, Mike could now see the bears clearly. The cubs were much smaller than they should be, probably born late in the season. Their chances of survival in these conditions were slim to none. The mother bear began pawing at the snow near his porch, attempting to create some form of shelter. But the wind whipped away any progress she made. The temperature continued to drop. Mike's thermometer now refused to give a reading, the liquid frozen solid inside. The wind grew stronger. He could see the larger bear trying to shield her cubs with her body, but it was a losing battle. One of the cubs stumbled, falling into the deep snow. The mother bear gently nudged it back up, but Mike could see the cub's movements becoming slower, more uncoordinated. Time was running out. The bears had been struggling for almost an hour now, and their condition was deteriorating rapidly. The second cub collapsed, and this time, getting back up took longer. The mother bear's attempts to help became weaker, her own strength fading. She let out another low moan, a sound filled with desperation that cut through the howling wind and straight to Mike's core. Mike found himself pressed against the window, his breath fogging the glass. He had photographed hundreds of bears in his career, documented their behavior, their struggles, and their triumphs, but he had never seen anything like this. The cold was killing them, slowly but surely, right in front of his eyes. The bears were now huddled directly against his porch, their last attempt to find any protection from the wind. The cubs were barely moving, and the mother bear's eyes were glazing over, the cold overwhelming even her massive body. In the beam of his flashlight, Mike could see their shivers becoming less frequent, a dangerous sign of hypothermia. Mike's hand rested on his cabin door handle. Everything he knew about wilderness safety, every rule he had followed for years, told him to stay inside. But as he watched the family of bears slowly freezing to death on his porch, another voice inside him grew stronger, a voice that asked what the value of survival rules was when weighed against dying creatures who needed help. The bears were no longer moving much at all. The cubs lay curled up against their mother, who had positioned herself between them and the wind. Her eyes met Mike's through the window, and in that moment, he saw something that shook him to his core. There was no aggression in that gaze, no wild fury, only exhaustion, desperation, and something that looked eerily like resignation. Time seemed to freeze along with the world outside as Mike stood with his hand on the door handle. Every survival instinct screamed at him to stay inside. He had seen what desperate bears could do, had photographed their power and ferocity. The mother bear, even in her weakened state, could kill him with a single swipe if she perceived him as a threat to her cubs. The wind rattled his cabin violently, and the bears had stopped shivering. Mike knew enough about hypothermia to understand what that meant. The cubs were entering the final stages of freezing to death, their small bodies giving up the fight against the cold. The mother bear's breathing had become shallow, her massive form now barely rising and falling in the growing mountain of snow. His emergency radio crackled with an updated weather report. The storm was expected to last at least another 12 hours, with conditions worsening. The bears would not survive the night. Already, ice had formed thick crusts on their fur, and their breathing was becoming dangerously slow. Mike's mind raced through his options. He had a storage room attached to his cabin, originally built to house his photography equipment. It was insulated, separate from his living space, and had its own entrance. It could serve as a temporary shelter, but getting 3 freezing bears into it would be another matter entirely. The risks were enormous. If the mother bear panicked, she could destroy his cabin, leaving them all to freeze in the storm. If she attacked him, help would not arrive in time. Even if they survived the night, having 3 bears this close to his living space could prove fatal in other ways. Mike thought about his camera, sitting unused on his desk. For years, he had documented wildlife without interfering, believing that nature should take its course without human intervention. But as he watched the cubs growing still, their small forms almost invisible under the growing layer of snow, he questioned everything he thought he knew about the relationship between humans and wildlife. The mother bear's eyes had never left him. There was something in that gaze that he had never seen before in all his years of wildlife photography. It was as if she understood that he represented their last chance at survival. Her usual wariness of humans seemed to have been overcome by maternal desperation. Another sharp crack echoed through the night as a branch snapped under the weight of ice and snow. The sound made Mike jump, but the bears barely responded. Their lethargy was reaching a critical point. The mother bear tried to nuzzle one of her cubs, but her movements were becoming uncoordinated. Soon, she would be too weak to move at all. Mike began to remove his heavy winter coat. If he was going to do this, he would need to be able to move quickly. He pulled on his thickest gloves and grabbed several heavy blankets from his emergency supplies. His hands shook as he checked his satellite phone one last time, knowing that in these conditions, it would be useless if things went wrong. The consequences of his next action would be irreversible. Opening that door would break every rule of wilderness safety he had lived by. It went against his training, his experience, and basic common sense. But as he watched another shuddering breath leave the mother bear's body, he realized that sometimes, survival required more than just following rules. He thought about his father's words again. Nature doesn't forgive carelessness. But was it carelessness to try to save a dying family? Was it reckless to risk everything to prevent the deaths of 3 magnificent creatures? The line between wisdom and foolishness had never seemed so thin. The cubs had stopped moving entirely now. Only the slight rise and fall of their chests showed they were alive. The mother bear's eyes were beginning to close, her massive body slowly slumping into the snow. The cold was winning its battle against even her incredible strength. In a few more minutes, it would be too late to do anything at all. Mike took a deep breath and began his final preparations. He turned up all his heating units, creating as much warmth as possible in the storage room. He positioned the blankets near the door where he could reach them quickly. His hands moved steadily now, purpose replacing uncertainty. The mother bear watched his movements through the window, her gaze following him as he worked. There was an intelligence in those eyes that spoke of understanding, of awareness that transcended the usual barriers between humans and wildlife. That moment, Mike saw not a dangerous predator but a mother fighting with her last breath to protect her children. The wind howled louder, and the temperature continued its merciless descent. Mike's clock showed just past 2 in the morning, the darkest hour of the night when the cold was at its most brutal. Everything he knew about bears, about survival, about the proper way to handle wildlife encounters, was about to be put to the test. His hand returned to the door handle. Through the frosted glass, he could see the 3 bears, their forms growing fainter under the falling snow. The next few moments would either be the bravest or the last decision of his life. Mike took one final breath and turned the handle. The door opened with a creak that seemed deafening in the frozen night. The wind immediately rushed in, bringing with it a blast of snow and bitter cold that stung his face. The bears were just feet away, their bodies now half buried in the mounting snowdrifts. Moving slowly, deliberately, Mike stepped onto his porch. The mother bear's eyes flickered, registering his presence, but she made no aggressive movement. Her survival instinct seemed to be warring with her exhaustion. She lifted her head slightly, nostrils flaring as she caught his scent, but even this small movement seemed to drain her remaining energy. Speaking in low, soft tones, Mike began to clear a path from his porch to the storage room door. Every movement was measured, non-threatening. "It's all right," he found himself whispering, though he knew the bears couldn't understand his words. The mother bear watched him, her eyes showing more awareness now but still no aggression. The cubs hadn't moved. Their small bodies were almost completely covered in snow, and Mike could barely see their breathing. Time was running out. In this weather, even these few minutes of exposure were dangerous. For him, despite his protective clothing, he had to act now or abandon the attempt entirely. With trembling hands, Mike opened the storage room door wide. Warm air rushed out, creating a brief fog in the frigid night. The mother bear's head lifted higher, her nostrils working as she sensed the heat. It was the most movement she had shown in the last hour. Mike's heart pounded as he took the most dangerous step of all. He moved closer to the bears, blankets in his hands. The mother bear's eyes tracked his movement, but her usual protective instincts seemed dulled by the cold and exhaustion. When he was within a few feet, he gently tossed one of the blankets over the cubs. The thick wool covered their small bodies, and for a terrifying moment, the mother bear tensed. Mike held his breath, knowing his life hung on her next reaction. But instead of attacking, she slowly, painfully began to nose the blanket around her cubs, seeming to understand its purpose. Encouraged, Mike spread another blanket closer to the storage room door, creating a path of warmth. His fingers were starting to go numb, and he knew he couldn't stay out much longer. Everything would depend on the mother bear's next decision. She tried to stand, her legs shaking with the effort. The cubs remained motionless under the blanket. With gentle movements that belied her size, she attempted to nudge one of the cubs. It didn't respond. The second cub lay equally still. A sound of distress rumbled from her throat, a mother's fear for her children cutting through the howling wind. Mike made his final move. He stepped back, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, until he stood near the storage room door. The warm air flowing out created a beacon in the darkness, a promise of survival. He waited, his heart thundering in his chest as the mother bear faced her own decision. The massive creature gathered her remaining strength. With agonizing slowness, she managed to get to her feet. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she stood swaying in the savage wind, her gaze moving between her cubs and the open door. Then, with infinite gentleness, she gripped the blanket covering her cubs in her teeth. Mike watched in awe as the mother bear, fighting against exhaustion with every step, began to drag her cubs toward the storage room door. The blanket helped them slide over the snow, but every movement clearly cost her precious energy. Her powerful muscles trembled with the effort, but her eternal instinct drove her forward. The distance was only a few yards, but it seemed like miles. Mike stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the bear family inched closer to safety. The wind grew stronger, nearly knocking him off his feet, but the mother bear pressed on, refusing to release her grip on the blanket that held her precious cargo. Finally, incredibly, they reached the door. The mother bear paused, her massive form blocking the entrance, steam rising from her fur as the warm air hit it. This was the moment of greatest danger. If she panicked now, in such close quarters, there would be no escape. But the bitter cold and her cubs' desperate need overcame her natural fear. With the last of her strength, she pulled her cubs over the threshold and into the warm room. Mike watched as the massive creature collapsed beside her children, her body curling protectively around them as warmth began to seep back into their frozen bodies. With infinite care, Mike closed the storage room door, his movements slow and deliberate. Through the door's small window, he could see the bear family huddled together in the warm space. The mother bear's eyes remained open, watching him, but the desperate tension in her body had begun to ease as the heat worked its way through her frozen fur. Over the next few hours, Mike kept vigil from his cabin, watching through the connecting window between his living space and the storage room. The storm outside reached its peak, rattling the walls of his cabin with unprecedented fury. But inside the storage room, a miracle was taking place. The cubs were the first to show signs of recovery. As their small bodies warmed, they began to stir. Their movements were weak at first, barely noticeable, but gradually grew stronger. The mother bear, despite her own exhaustion, tenderly nuzzled each cub, encouraging them back to life. She never took her eyes off the window where Mike watched, but the look in them had changed from desperate resignation to something that seemed almost like trust. By dawn, the cubs were awake and moving, their natural curiosity returning as they explored their temporary shelter. The mother bear remained alert but calm, seeming to understand that this strange situation was their salvation. The storm raged for 2 more days. During this time, Mike carefully placed water and food near the storage room door when the bears were sleeping. The mother bear accepted these offerings, her initial wariness giving way to a cautious acceptance of his presence. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. The world outside was transformed into a crystalline landscape of snow and ice, but the temperature had begun to rise. Mike knew it was time. The bears needed to return to the wild before they became too accustomed to human presence. As if sensing this, the mother bear had grown more restless. With careful movements, Mike opened the storage room's outer door. Fresh air and sunlight streamed in, and the mother bear lifted her head, sensing the changed weather. At the doorway, the mother bear paused, turning her head toward Mike. Their eyes met one final time before she led her cubs back into the wild, leaving only tracks in the snow as evidence of their extraordinary encounter. If this amazing story of compassion and survival touched your heart, make sure you do not miss out on more incredible wildlife encounters. Subscribe to our channel now and join our growing community of nature enthusiasts.